Hi there, everyone. So today we are going to actually derive the infamous quadratic formula. So we're going to actually use those skills that I just taught you previously on using our tools for completing the square. That's actually where the quadratic formula comes from. We have to use completing the square to do it. So first thing, you guys should remember that this right here is our standard form. Okay, so that is in standard form for solving a quadratic. Okay, so first thing, and I'm going to give you guys the first step, and we actually are going to go through this together, but really if we were, ideally in class, I would give you guys the entire period to actually explore this and see if you can come up with how to derive this on your own. But again, circumstances are a little different. We are going to walk through this together. So first thing we're going to do is we start off with our standard form of ax squared plus bx plus c equaling 0. Our next step is we divide everything out by a. So we'll be left with the following. So let's do that. Divide everything out by a. What you do to one side, you must do to the other. Okay, so what we'll be left with, and again, I already gave it to you here, is that x squared plus b over a x plus c over a equals 0. Okay, now I said we're going to use our strategy of completing the square. Remember, when we complete the square, we bring the constant over to the other side. So in this situation, c over a, that's just a constant, right? Here we have a variable, there's a variable, so this is a coefficient right here, this b over a. But c over a, there's no variable attached, so that's a constant. So let's bring over c over a. We're going to start by completing the square. Okay, so I'm going to subtract over my c over a, subtract over my c over a. Okay, and then in our third step, we will be left with here, x squared plus b over a x plus the blanks, because we're completing the square, plus the blanks on both sides. Okay, now we're going to start with our next step to say, let's complete the square. Okay, so now when we complete the square, remember, we have our x plus whatever it is here squared is going to equal, and then we would combine like terms here on the right. Now remember, when you complete the square, you have the b term. So in this situation here, that's my b term. So I have b over a, and I want to cut it in half. So I have b over a divided by 2. Really, we can rewrite this, right? I don't like having a fraction over a fraction. So we can do keep, change, flip. And now I have b over 2a. So that's what I'm going to fill in right over here, right? We have the b term. So I have plus b over 2a. Okay, so again, this comes from having our b term, in this case, our b term. Okay, I'll write that here. B term is b over a, but then we have it. Okay, and then our next step for completing the square is then we square it. So now I'm going to square b over 2a. So b over 2a squared, well, that's just b squared over 2 squared is 4, and then I have a squared. So that's what we're writing in our plus on both sides. So this is b squared over 4a squared, b squared over 4a squared. All right, so again, we have the b term, and then we squared it on both sides. Again, this is totally different for you guys because you're not used to using variables. But again, like I said, we're deriving the quadratic formula. So there aren't going to be any numbers. All right, so let's just clean up what we have here. Okay, so this is what we were left with. Again, we completed the square. Now, if I want to combine what's on the right-hand side here, we want to get like denominators. So that's going to be our fourth step. Get like denominators. Okay, well, if I want to get these denominators to be the same, well, let's see. If I look, negative c over a, so the denominator is a, and then I have b squared over 4a squared. The denominator is 4a squared. So this denominator here is missing a 4a. So let's multiply the top and the bottom by 4a. So we'll write in our fifth step. We have x plus that b over 2a squared. We didn't do anything here. And now we're multiply our negative c over a term by 4a over 4a. Okay, so now we have negative 4ac over 4a squared plus nothing happened to this term plus b squared over 4a squared. Okay, continuing on. All right, so that was in this line, and this was all together. Okay. Okay, now let's combine like terms. So let's simplify the right-hand side of the equation. So let's write, so our sixth step, we're going to simplify the right-hand side of the equation. So simplify right-hand side of equal sign. Okay, because they have the same denominator here. So we'll write, we have our x plus b over 2a squared is equal to negative 4ac plus b squared over 4a squared. We can combine them like this because, again, the denominators are the same here. Okay, because the denominators are the same. We then can combine the numerators. Okay, I am going to rearrange the terms because you should remember the formula for the quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I have that b squared minus 4ac here. I just want to rearrange the terms. Okay, so let's rearrange the terms. Okay, and really that's just using the commutative property. Okay, what we want to do next now is we want to square root both sides, right? We want to get rid of this squared. So we'll square root this x plus b over 2a, and we'll square root over here, this b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. So here, in this step, we square root both sides. All right, we're getting there. We are slowly but surely getting there. Okay, well, now that we've taken the square root, let's see what happens. Okay, and don't forget this was squared, right? I just forgot to write that. So because this was squared, we square rooted, so this goes away. So now in my ninth step, we have x plus b over 2a is equal to the square root. Don't forget your plus or minus. Okay, b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. Now, we can simplify the right-hand side, right? I can simplify the right-hand side. By simplifying, if I simplify the right-hand side, I can take the square root of this denominator, right? I can leave this as my x plus b over 2a is equal to plus or minus the square root. Leave the square root of the numerator and take the square root of the denominator. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of a squared is a. And we're almost done. We're just going to bring over our negative. We're going to bring over the positive 2a, which will make it negative b over 2a. So we'll have x equals, so let's say we're going to subtract both sides by b over 2a. All right, so now I have x equals negative b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And our last step is just simplify. Now we're left with our end goal right here. Right? If I simplify the terms, you can combine the numerator. Right? We can add our numerator together because we have the same denominator. And there we go. We got to our end goal. All right, guys, so this was the derivation from all the way up here. All I started with, literally all I started with was this. Oop, right here. That's what I started with. And I was able to derive all the way down here our quadratic equation. So now we're actually going to apply this. Now we're going to use the quadratic formula. So we have the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's write it out at the top here. All right, so if I look at my first example here, and we're just going to do these two together. Okay, so these are the only problems, actually, I believe I included in here. Yep. So let's just do these together. So we have a equals, well, a again, we have ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is the leading coefficient, b is our coefficient, and then c is the constant. So a here is 19, right, number in front of the x squared. B is negative 17, the number in front of x. And then lastly, our constant is 11. So that's C. Okay, and now, guys, we're just going to fill in for the quadratic formula. So let's write. We have x equals negative b. I always like to do my parentheses first. Plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, so we'll fill those in. All right, so we have x equals negative b. So we have negative 17 plus or minus the square root of negative 17 squared, right, b squared, minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, just using, I color-coded all that here. All right, using my fancy schmancy calculator, you guys are going to put this, don't put the whole thing in the calculator, just put what's underneath the radical. So when I type into my calculator, what's underneath the radical here, I have x equals, well, negative negative is a positive, plus or minus the square root of, I end up getting 213 all over 19 times 2 is 38. Okay, so this right here, I just typed it into my calculator, what's under the radical. There you have it. That's my answer. Okay, let's look at question 2. All right, so I'm going to erase what I have on the screen here just to make some room. All right, so again, we know our formula for a quadratic is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I always like to put parentheses around whatever I'm inputting, which is all of my variables here. Okay, well, we need to get this equation here in standard form. So in this case, we're using y instead of x. Sure, no problem. So to get this in standard form, right, well, let's bring over the 4. So I have y squared minus 2y minus 4 is going to equal 0. And now we can just write out what are all of our values for a, b, and c. So the number out front here, that's our a value, is 1. My b value right here is negative 2. Don't forget the negative. It's negative 2. And then my c value is right here, the constant, negative 4. All right, so here we go. Y equals negative, parentheses, plus or minus the square root, parentheses squared, minus 4. Guys, the reason why I'm including all these parentheses is because you're not going to get it wrong. All right, a lot of times when students type this into the calculator, if they don't include parentheses, it's not going to be right, especially when we're dealing with negatives. Okay, so we have y equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. All right, so let's start to simplify. And guys, remember, you have a calculator, you should not be typing this all into the calculator at once. So when I type into the calculator, you should only be typing in what's under the radical. Don't include the radical, just what's under. And we'll have y equals, again, this is a negative negative, so that's positive 2, plus or minus the square root. Negative 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 4 ends up being 20. So this whole thing ends up being 20. Okay, all over 2. And you guys should remember how to simplify radicals. So the square root of 20, I can break that up as the square root of 4 and the square root of 5, right? Because 4 times 5 is 20. And I picked the largest perfect square, which in this case is 4. So I have the square root of 4 reduces to 2, and the square root of 5 stays along for the ride. So we are left with y equals 2 plus or minus 2 radical 5 over 2. And I can use the heart method or pretzel method, whatever you prefer. We have y then equals 2 over 2 is 1, plus or minus 2 over 2 again is 1, and you leave the radical 5. You don't really need to write that 1 here, so I'm actually just going to leave my answer like this, okay, because that's how you would enter your answer. All right, guys, I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out and ask.